these islands are unique. Located in southeastern North Carolina in the Cape Fear River, these 3 islands are special places because they are the home to 15 different species of seabirds: the ibis, the blue heron, the pelican, and the egret. What makes these islands different than most is that 2 of the 3 are man-made. By creating these islands, man is helping these birds to rebuild their population in this area on the Atlantic coast. These islands are special because of the cooperative effort of the private sector, the state and federal governments, which have maintained these islands as a protected location for the breeding cycles of these birds. We plan to record the breeding cycles of the birds on these islands. We will explore the many problems, those that are natural and man-made, that the birds encounter. Dr. James Parnell of the University of North Carolina at Wilmington is leading the research team that is studying these islands. He shared some of his insights in this interview with us.
Dr. Parnell, on average, there are 15 species on these 3 island rookeries. Is it unique, the interrelationship of the birds?
The uniqueness of the Lower Cape Fear River relates primarily to the presence of the birds and of their dependence upon man in a variety of ways. Battery Island, the site of the heronry, its origin is not clear, but it has certainly been dumped on by the Corps of Engineers in their dredging process along the coast. And certainly in that sense, man has affected their presence. The 2 islands upriver that are utilized by pelicans, laughing gulls, royal terns, and some other terns are purely man-made. These are dredged material deposit islands that are built by the Corps of Engineers as a part of their maintenance of the Lower Cape Fear River Channel. Those islands are the only suitable islands for ground nesters in the Lower Cape Fear River, and they're very much dependent upon man. The uniqueness, I think, of the situation is that within the past few months, there has been a very interesting cooperation among private, state, and federal agencies to help assure not only the protection of those islands, but the very presence of some of them. The Corps of Engineers has agreed, for example, to actually dump dredged spoil material on one of the sites which is eroding very badly in order to maintain it as a viable nesting site for brown pelicans and other ground nesters. The National Audubon Society has just obtained a lease from the state to Battery Island and will now maintain Battery as an Audubon sanctuary whose primary function will be to learn to manage colonial warbirds. We need to know how to manage them in order to maintain these sites and to keep them where they are. So it's a rather unique combination of human factors interacting to maintain the birds.
Dr. Parnell, if viewed from an airplane along the coastal areas of North Carolina or from a boat, to the layman there seem to be similar islands in nature to these. However, year after year, these species return to these 3 specific islands. What's so attractive about them?
Actually, in the Lower Cape Fear River, first of all, along the North Carolina coast, the ground nesting gulls and terns and the herons typically breed near inlets or river mouths, where apparently food supplies are more abundant than in areas away from these exits to the ocean. In the Lower Cape Fear, the 2 islands that the ground nester is using are really the only 2 suitable islands in the river. There are some other islands that are similar, but they are much larger. They're often more heavily vegetated. In some cases, they have mammalian predators on them. Ground nesters require islands generally that are well enough isolated that things like raccoons don't get to them, and so they're protected. There are a number of other sites on the Lower Cape Fear that do appear suitable for heronries, and why the birds chose Battery, I really don't know. But we do know that once herons choose a site, they tend to maintain a traditional aspect to their use of it and will often continue to return for many years, even after the island really is no longer as suitable as it was when they first arrived. My guess is that the birds are using Battery now primarily simply because their parents and grandparents nested there, and they come back to the same place as long as it's suitable and as long as they're not unduly disturbed.
Dr. Parnell, there is a tremendous growth of human population in this sector of North Carolina, particularly during the breeding season. The recreational activities of man seems to be impacting these islands. Why is it important now to study them and to protect them, not only from the very presence of man, but his waste?
There is an increasing use of the Cape Fear River, especially during the summertime, by boaters, fishermen, and others. And the level of disturbance on these islands is increasing, mostly by well-wishing people, but people who simply are interested and would like to see the birds. So we think it's important that they receive additional protection and that we have a better understanding of the effect that people are having on them. One of the things that we expect to do at Battery Island is to attempt to learn how one can manage such a site to maintain it as a viable bird colony in the face, really, of the birds themselves. One of the things that herons do, and perhaps especially ibises, is that they fertilize the vegetation in which they're nesting so severely that often the plants die back from over-fertilization. If there are lots of nesting sites available, and if the birds can freely move somewhere else after they've killed the vegetation back, this is no major problem. But if you wish to maintain birds on a particular place for many years, we think it's going to be necessary to manage. We think it's going to be necessary, for example, to go in and attempt to find out what it is that is actually happening to the vegetation, determine which species are more resistant to this kind of damage than others, and perhaps to actually plant plants that will tolerate the birds themselves.
Dr. Parnell, we've established the importance of the land locations as rookeries. How important is the feeding environment for those parent birds around these islands, and what impact adversely could we potentially have on this area in the next few years?
Feeding sites obviously are tremendously important. You're not going to have large concentrations of birds where there's not also a large concentration of food. So I would anticipate that one of the reasons that they're there is simply the fact that there are adequate food supplies for large numbers of birds in the area. You're aware of the fact that the Bald Head marshes contain something like 6,000 acres of shallow waters and marshes. The Cape Fear estuary obviously contains several times that amount. Estuaries traditionally are rich feeding areas for birds, great nursery areas for fish. And so I think it's pretty clear that this is an area rich in food supplies. With Wilmington, with the developing industry along the river, there are problems, or at least potential problems. We had an oil spill last year on the river. While most folks thought that didn't do any damage, some pelican eggs were affected by oil, and goodness only knows what else was affected in the river. On the other hand, there are many rivers in the southern U.S. which are probably much more polluted than the Cape Fear, which also have good bird concentration. So it's not an automatic that with increased industrial development there will be a decrease in bird life. It is automatic that if the habitat goes, the birds will go. So I think it is important that we do maintain that estuary. It is important that we understand what's there and how the birds relate to the estuary so that we can monitor them properly and so that we can see changes if they begin to occur as we affect the estuary in a stronger manner in the future. And certainly that's going to happen. It's going to develop, as you know.